Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be talking with the music director of Music of the Baroque, Jane Glover, from her home in London. As you know, Jane has written the book Handel in London. And today we're going to specifically focus on, of course, his life in London, but really his work as a businessman, as a professional, making a living as he did in the first half of the 18th century in London. Jane, welcome. How are you?
I'm very well, missing you all very much, but it's lovely to see you.
Some of our audience will already know quite a lot about this subject because you've given a soiree to Music of the Baroque members, the audience members who've enjoyed your talks. But for those maybe who are tuning in for the first time into this fascinating subject, let's talk a little bit about Handel. First of all, his background. When we look at the Baroque era, we think of two composers primarily, J.S. Bach and George Friedrich Handel, both German, both born in 1685. Bach stayed in Germany, Handel traveled. What can you tell us about his early life? What kind of a background did he have?
Unlike Bach, he didn't come from this massive musical family. His father was actually a barber surgeon. It's curious to think that those two professions were the same one in the 18th century, but they were. And he actually didn't really approve of music in the family at all. He was very suspicious of it. His elder son went off to be a valet to a local dignitary. And I think Father Handel wanted his younger son, Georg, as we must call him at this point, to be some sort of dignitary and official as well. But the boy was obviously very musical. One of his early biographers, a man called English biographer called John Mannering, is utterly unreliable because he did it all from memory. But he did tell us that that Handel managed to get a harpsichord secretly brought into the house so he could practice in the attic. He was apparently 7 years old when he did this, and I'm not sure we can believe that. Everything changed for him, though, when his father died. Handel was only 12, and suddenly I think he assumed responsibility, a huge sense of responsibility for his widowed mother. And I think, in a sense, this is where the beginning of his business sense is. That he felt he had to earn enough money to look after her. I mean, she did have some money of her own, of course, and I think the elder son was also sending money back, but he really felt he had to do his bit. And when he got a job at 16 as an organist, he would give little bits back to his mother. When he left Halle, where they lived, and went to Hamburg to work in the opera house there, still only a teenager, he was still sending sums of money back to his mother. And I think it was this early bereavement, losing his father, which began to instill in him this acute sense for money and business.
Now, he wrote so many amazing works that we recognize instantly nowadays. Things like the music for the Royal Fireworks, the water music, so many great operas, over 40 operas, so many oratorios. We're going to talk about all of this through the course of our discussion. But I want to get to some music pretty quickly. And so we're going to do a fast forward to the coronation of George II in 1727, just so that we can play Zadok the Priest, one of 4 coronation anthems that he wrote. Why don't we just race ahead in time and tell us about the context of this amazing coronation anthem?
He wrote 4 anthems for that amazing day for different places in the ceremony, which took quite a long time. The best known of them, I'm pretty sure, is Zadok the Priest, which was actually the second one to be performed. And it comes at the moment of the anointing, which is a very important moment in the ceremony. It's not the actual coronation, but it's the anointing. And it was so successful, this anthem, that actually George II's grandson, who eventually succeeded him, George III, wanted it performed at his own coronation, and it has been performed at every coronation since. I'm sure it'll be at Charles's and Williams and little George's as well.
Handel's Coronation Anthem #1, Zadok the Priest. So Jane, before Handel got to London, of course, he traveled quite a bit, first of all in Germany, but importantly to Italy, which was the center of opera back then in the early 18th century, right?
Yes, very much so. It was sort of the center of music, actually. Italy, really from the Renaissance onwards, was the center of culture. Throughout Europe, whatever the local variants were, Italy seemed to be controlling everything, and everybody wanted to go to Italy. It's the time of the Grand Tour. You know, people were actually traveling to Italy very much, whether they were musicians or not, but you know, to see the cities, to see the ancient ruins, to just absorb the great culture and the great art. But Handel certainly wanted to go there for all of that, to learn the language, of course, but to rub shoulders with some of the great composers of the day, like Corelli and Scarlatti, whom he met in Rome. And he went as a quite young man, and spent some time in Rome, and indeed was part of this extraordinary group of composers based there, and learnt so much from them. It wrote a lot of sort of cantatas, wrote a lot of early oratorios, and eventually he was invited to Venice to write an opera, Agrippina, which just made him one of the most successful composers in Europe. Suddenly everybody knew who Handel was. I mean, we have to remember that there's no such thing as social media in the 18th century. And when I say he was instantly known, it would have taken a few months for that reputation to have traveled, but my goodness, it did. And suddenly he was rather sought after. He was an incredibly charismatic person. He was very gifted. He was just a brilliant player. So you know, he could sweep into any drawing room in Europe and sit down at the keyboard and play dazzlingly, which everybody adored. He also had this wonderful ebullient personality. He was always very good company. Loved a good meal and a good drink. You know, I mean, all of that. But he was also just absorbing so much music and so many influences and so much language. And I always say with Handel, you know, with that big brain of his, there was no delete. Everything was just stored in there. And at some point he would bring something out and turn it into something, and maybe put it back again and then use it again later on. It was a very, very fertile, active brain that he had. And in his Italian years, he was just filling it up.
Well, one of the works that he wrote there is Dixit Dominus, which we're going to hear next. What can you tell us about that? Why is it important?
Well, it's a great piece of music, is it not? It's something we do a lot with music of the Baroque, and it's just one of those early pieces. I mean, he was in his early 20s, which is bursting with confidence, and it's certainly not easy. I mean, it's quite a ride for the chorus, which of course our brilliant chorus had no problem with it, even when Nicholas takes it at 185 miles an hour. It's great. But I think you can tell from this that it's, you know, it's a psalm, but it's a cheerful one, and it's got all the confidence of Handel's youth, and I think his joy at being in Italy at this time.
Wonderful. That was part of Handel's Dixie Dominus, performed by the Chorus and Orchestra of Music of the Baroque, conducted on that occasion by Nicholas Kramer. So he went to London in 1710. What attracted him to England?
I'm often asked, since I read the book, why did he come to London in the first place? And that's a very good question, because, we've seen him born in Halle, trained in Hamburg, then down to Rome and Venice. I think he had thoughts about maybe going to Paris or to Vienna or to Berlin or to Prague or, one of these big European capitals where there was good music. And, he might have done that, except that while he was in Venice and having this big success with Agrippina, he had two invitations pretty much on the same night. One was from Lord Manchester, who was a sort of British envoy in Venice, who said, you really ought to come to London. There's so much going on there. We've got this great operatic tradition, we blah, 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 which is not exactly true. But I think there's stuff you would like. And the other person he met was the ambassador from the Hanoverian establishment, the Elector of Hanover, who said, come to Hanover. So he, in fact, did both. He went to Hanover first and met the then Elector, who turned out a few years later to become George I in that extraordinary dog's leg in British history. And more to the point, met his son, who was to be George II, and his son's wife, who became Queen Caroline. And they became very good friends. And I think this is crucial to Handel's move to London. It was sort of known that when Queen Anne, who was on the British throne at the time, was no more, that she had no heirs, that therefore the throne would come to her nearest cousins, who were this lot in Hanover. And therefore they were prepared for this to happen. And I think there's some sort of collusion in the fact that Handel was sent to London, maybe as a sort of, go and suss that out for us, see how you get on, because he must have talked to them about, thinking of going to London. Great idea, you go to London and tell us about it. So he came to London first in 1710, and his reputation, as I say, had preceded him. And the people who were running the opera houses in London, particularly a man called Aaron Hill, who ran the Queen's Theatre in the Haymarket, thought, hooray, because he'd been trying to get opera on in London, and with rather mediocre composers. And what he really wanted was a brilliant composer. And he also wanted to spend a lot of attention on visual presentation of opera, so that he wanted everything to look fantastic as well. And so he got the best designers, and he got a good libretto for his opera Rinaldo, and then Handel arrived, and there you were, there's your team. Handel absolutely couldn't believe his luck. No sooner had he stepped off his boat from Holland, then he was practically offered to write this opera for the Queen's Theatre, and he threw everything at Rinaldo. I mean, he wrote amazing arias, he wrote fabulously arresting music with trumpets and timps, he wrote soft, beguiling music with practically nothing or a few flutes. He wrote one aria with a huge harpsichord part for himself to play as well, so he could show that off. He just threw his entire box of tricks at Rinaldo, and of course it was the biggest success you could imagine. And that the Hanoverians were delighted that Handel was here in London and could write music for all their events. Obviously moving forward to the coronation, which I talked about earlier, but George I, who was a much more, well, he didn't speak English very well, that's the first thing, but he was also a more private person than his son, who sort of loved pageantry and ceremony and wanted a fabulous coronation. George I was rather more retiring than that, but he was a great fan of Handel's, and he did give one very rare party on the river Thames. And he said to Handel, I want a lot of music to be written for this party. We're going to fill a couple of barges and we're going to go upstream to Richmond. We're going to have a lovely supper and have some lovely music all the way and all the way back. And so you can see what I'm leaning towards. Handel wrote what we now know as the water music, which is, if you think about it, completely astonishing, because he had to write music for all sorts of instruments to be played on a moving barge outside, no acoustic. And yet somehow he did it. He just had that knack of writing the right music for the right event. And there, of course, are quieter moments in the water music, which I think would have been played inside that hall in Richmond when they were having their supper, before they all came back again. Apparently the king loved it so much that he asked for all of it to be played 3 times. So the musicians certainly earned their buck that night.
Fascinating. Well, let's hear some of the water music. Part of Handel's water music. That performance actually from Baroque in the Park, the concert that we did in Millennium Park a couple of years ago.
As near as possible that we could get to a river. We certainly got near to the lake, and we performed it outside. So
it's right beside the Chicago River. But actually, that's a good idea. Maybe someday we should try and do water music on the Chicago River.
I've been longing to do that for 20 years.
Okay, we'll work on it. Watch this space.